Dean Martin's finger stopped inches from Elvis Presley's face. The entire backstage corridor went silent. Technicians who had been rushing toward the stage suddenly stopped moving. Musicians lowered their instruments. A producer slowly removed his headset. And Elvis Presley did absolutely nothing. He simply stood there. Dark sunglasses covered his eyes. His white stage suit glittered beneath the harsh backstage lights. Beyond the curtain, thousands of people were waiting for him. But back here, there was no applause. No cameras. No host to rescue either man if things went too far. Dean's face was red with anger. "You want me to say it again?" Elvis remained silent. Dean stepped closer, then delivered the words loudly enough for everyone in the corridor to hear. "You can't sing." Nobody laughed. Dean pointed toward the stage. "You know what you've got out there." Elvis waited. Screaming girls, flashing lights, fancy clothes. Dean looked slowly from Elvis's jeweled collar to his boots, then shook his head. "Take all that away." He leaned closer. "And what are you?" Someone near the curtain quietly stepped backward. Everyone expected Elvis to explode. This was Elvis Presley, one of the most famous entertainers alive. He could have reminded Dean about the records, the crowds, the sold-out performances. He could have demanded an apology. Instead, Elvis slowly reached toward his face. He removed his sunglasses, folded them carefully, placed them on an equipment case, then looked directly into Dean's eyes. "Are you finished?" Dean froze. There was no anger in Elvis's voice. That somehow made the question more intimidating. Dean laughed. "Did I hurt the king's feelings?" Elvis shook his head. "No." Then he glanced toward the stage. "But I think you're asking the right question." Elvis looked back at him. "For the wrong reason." Dean's smile disappeared. "What does that mean?" Elvis pointed toward the curtain. "You want to know what happens when you take everything away?" "The band." Dean nodded. "The lights." "Sure." "The clothes." Dean smiled. "Exactly." Elvis stepped closer. "Then let's find out." Suddenly, the argument wasn't an argument anymore. A producer rushed between them. "Elvis, we're live in a few minutes. Whatever this is, forget it." Elvis shook his head. "No." "Elvis, I don't want the orchestra." The producer stared. "What?" "No orchestra." Elvis continued. "No backup singers." The producer's expression changed. "No effects." Then Elvis looked straight at Dean. "Just one microphone." Dean stopped smiling, because Elvis had done something he hadn't expected. He had accepted the challenge. Minutes later, the curtain opened. The audience erupted. Elvis walked onto the stage alone. But almost immediately, people realized something was wrong. The orchestra remained seated. No guitar. No drums. No introduction. At center stage stood one microphone beneath one spotlight. Elvis walked toward it. Behind the curtain, Dean watched with folded arms. Elvis reached the microphone and raised one hand. The screams gradually disappeared. He looked across the theater, then spoke. "Tonight I was reminded of something." Silence. Sometimes people become so interested in the person standing under the lights. He paused, that they forget to listen to what's coming from inside him. Backstage, Dean's expression hardened. Elvis continued. "So tonight, let's take everything else away. And right before Elvis did exactly that, tell me, where are you watching from? Write your city or country in the comments. And if you love powerful stories about Elvis Presley and legendary entertainers, like this video, comment below, share it with another Elvis fan, and subscribe, because Dean Martin believed he had just exposed Elvis's greatest weakness. What happened under that spotlight would make him question everything he thought he knew. Elvis closed his eyes. He inhaled. Then he sang. No guitar supported him. No piano softened the silence. No drums created momentum. No backup singers covered mistakes. Nothing. Only Elvis Presley's voice. The first notes were almost frighteningly soft. You could hear him breathe between phrases. Every imperfection would be exposed. If his voice cracked, everyone would hear it. If his control failed, everyone would know. Dean watched from behind the curtain, waiting, perhaps expecting Elvis to overperform, to scream, to force the audience into submission. But Elvis did the opposite. He made the room come to him. His voice began low, intimate, almost fragile. And somewhere inside those notes lived every year that had brought him to that microphone. The poverty, the rejection, the ridicule, the people who had once said he looked wrong, moved wrong, sounded wrong, the nights when nobody knew Elvis Presley, and the years when suddenly everybody did. He had learned something fame rarely admitted. Applause could be deafening, while loneliness remained completely silent. Elvis poured all of it into the performance. Backstage, Dean stopped moving. His folded arms slowly loosened. The voice grew, not simply louder, deeper, more vulnerable, more human. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Another audience member lowered his head. Someone began crying. Then Elvis approached a note nobody expected. His voice climbed, higher, stronger, until the entire theater seemed to rise with it. And Elvis held it. No orchestra beneath him. No singers around him. Nothing supporting him except breath control. And emotion. Dean's face changed. The arrogance began disappearing, because he was suddenly realizing what he had misunderstood. Elvis's greatest instrument wasn't the orchestra. It wasn't the rhinestones. It wasn't the movement. It wasn't even his voice alone. It was his ability to make another human being feel what he was feeling. Elvis finally released the note. His voice descended. Then he delivered the final phrase, almost like a whisper. And stopped. Silence. 1 second. 2. 3. Elvis opened his eyes. Nobody applauded. For one terrifying moment, the theater remained completely frozen. Dean stared from backstage. Then, one person stood. Another followed. Then another. Suddenly, the entire room erupted. People rose from their seats. Applause crashed through the theater. Elvis stepped away from the microphone. But he didn't smile triumphantly. He didn't point backstage. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply bowed his head. And somehow, that hurt Dean more than humiliation would have. Because Elvis had been given the perfect opportunity to destroy him publicly. And he had refused to take it. Dean slowly turned away from the stage. A producer approached him. "You okay?" Dean didn't answer. The applause continued roaring beyond the curtain. Then footsteps approached. Dean looked up. Elvis had returned backstage. Sweat covered his face. His breathing was still heavy. The corridor became silent again. Elvis saw Dean, then started walking directly toward him. One step. Another. Another. Dean swallowed. Elvis stopped in front of him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, Dean broke the silence. "Well," Elvis frowned. "Well, what?" Dean stared at him. "Aren't you going to say it?" "Say what?" Dean's voice dropped. "That I was wrong." Elvis studied him, then slowly shook his head. "I didn't sing that for you." Dean froze. Elvis picked up his sunglasses, then added quietly, "I sang because you reminded me why I started." Dean had no answer. But before Elvis could walk away, Dean asked one final question. "Why?" Elvis stopped. Dean stepped toward him. "You had the whole room standing." His voice tightened. "You could have come back here and rubbed it in my face." Elvis slowly turned. Every technician in the corridor was watching. Dean stared at him. "Why didn't you?" Elvis looked at him for a long moment, then gave an answer nobody backstage was prepared to hear. "Because making you feel small." Elvis paused. "Wouldn't make me any bigger." Dean Martin's expression changed instantly. And what happened next would prove that Elvis hadn't merely won over the audience. He was about to force the man who had insulted him to confront something far more painful than being wrong about Elvis Presley. Dean was about to confront himself. Dean Martin stood completely still. The applause from the theater was still roaring beyond the curtain, but backstage, the silence felt heavier than anything the audience had just heard. Elvis Presley had answered the insult. Not with anger, not with a speech, not by listing records or reminding anyone of his fame. He had simply walked beneath a spotlight, removed the orchestra, the backup singers, the effects, and everything Dean claimed was hiding him. And sang. Now Dean had asked why Elvis hadn't returned backstage to humiliate him. Elvis's answer still hung in the corridor. "Because making you feel small wouldn't make me any bigger." Dean looked away. That sentence had done what Elvis's performance could not. It forced him inward. For several seconds, nobody spoke. A technician pretended to adjust a cable. A musician stared at the floor. The producer, who had tried to stop the confrontation earlier, now stood near the curtain, watching both men carefully. Dean finally exhaled. "You really believe that?" Elvis folded his sunglasses in one hand. "Yes." Dean gave a bitter laugh. "You had every reason to embarrass me." "I know. You could have walked back here and said I was a fool." Elvis said nothing. Dean turned toward him. "You could have told everybody I didn't know what I was talking about." Elvis calmly replied. "Would that have made the performance better?" Dean stopped. Elvis continued. "Would it have made the audience feel more?" "No." "Would it have made me a better singer?" Dean hesitated. "No." Elvis nodded. "Then what would it have done?" Dean had no answer. Elvis stepped closer. "It would have made you smaller." A pause. "And I don't need that." Dean's expression tightened. "Why not?" Elvis looked toward the stage. "Because if I'm good at what I do." He turned back. "I don't need you to be bad at what you do." The corridor went silent again. "And if I'm confident in who I am." Elvis slowly put his sunglasses back on. "I don't need to destroy your confidence to prove mine. Dean lowered his eyes. For the first time since the argument began, he no longer looked angry. He looked ashamed. That was worse. Anger had protected him. Shame didn't. Dean had walked into the confrontation, believing he was exposing Elvis. Now he realized he had exposed himself. His pride. His need to test another man. His belief that one person's greatness somehow threatened his own. Elvis turned to leave. "Kid." He stopped. Dean stepped forward, then extended his hand. "I was wrong." Elvis looked at it. Dean swallowed. "Not just about your voice." Elvis raised an eyebrow. Dean looked toward the curtain where the audience was still applauding. "I thought I was testing whether you were a real singer." He looked back at Elvis. His voice became quieter. "Turns out I was testing what kind of man you were." Elvis stared at him for a moment, then shook his hand. Dean smiled sadly. "And I think I got my answer." Elvis could have ended it there. Instead, he placed his other hand over Dean's. "You're a great singer, Dean." Dean looked genuinely confused. "What? You heard me? After everything I said?" Elvis nodded. Dean stared at him. "How can you say that?" Elvis gave a small smile. "Because your talent doesn't disappear just because you were wrong about mine." Dean didn't know what to say. That may have been the first moment of the night when he truly lost his defenses. Around them, musicians and crew members watched in silence. They had expected a battle between two enormous personalities. Instead, they were seeing something much rarer. One man had attacked another man's talent. The other had answered with his art. And when the applause gave him every possible advantage, he refused to turn victory into humiliation. The producer finally stepped closer. "We need to reset for the next segment." Elvis nodded. Dean started walking away, then stopped. "Elvis." Elvis turned. Dean's face had become serious again. "I need to ask you something." "What?" "When I said you couldn't sing." He hesitated. "Did it hurt?" Elvis looked at him. "Yes." Dean seemed surprised. "You didn't show it." "That doesn't mean it wasn't there." Dean stuttered him. "So why didn't you get angry?" Elvis looked toward the stage again. Because he had heard versions of Dean's words before. Long before the white suits. Long before the screaming fans. People had told him he looked strange. Moved strangely. Sounded wrong. Too different. Too dangerous. Too much. At first, every doubt had felt like a wound. Then Elvis learned something. There would always be another person waiting to tell you why you couldn't do what you were already doing. He looked back at Dean. "People will doubt you your whole life." Dean listened. "You can spend your life fighting every person who says you can't." Elvis pointed toward the stage. "Or you can spend that time becoming so good that the argument answers itself." Dean's expression changed again. He nodded. Slowly. "That's a good line." Elvis smiled. "I wasn't trying to make one." Dean laughed. For the first time that night, the laugh wasn't cruel. The tension began to loosen. Then a stage manager hurried down the corridor. "Dean, you're on in 3. Dean nodded. He started toward the curtain. But as he reached it, he stopped and looked back. Elvis was already walking away. Dean called, "Hey, King." Elvis turned. Dean hesitated, then smiled. "Not bad." Elvis laughed. Thank you. Dean disappeared through the curtain. But the story didn't end there. Because several minutes later, Elvis stood alone in a dressing room. The applause was gone. The stage was distant. His sunglasses rested on the table. For the first time since Dean confronted him, Elvis allowed himself to breathe. He looked at his own reflection, then quietly repeated the insult. You can't sing. The words sounded different now. Less dangerous, but not harmless. Elvis stared at himself. Fame had never erased doubt. It had only made the doubts louder when they came. Because when millions believe in you, one person saying they don't can still find the weakest place inside. There was a knock. Elvis turned. The producer entered. You all right? Yes. You sure? Elvis nodded. The producer leaned against the door. That was risky. Elvis smiled faintly. What was? Going out there without the band. I know. You could have fallen apart. I know. You could have proved Dean right. Elvis looked at him. That was the point. The producer frowned. Elvis continued. If I only sing when everything is perfect. He gestured toward the stage. Then maybe he was right. The producer stared. Elvis looked toward the microphone visible through the curtain. I needed to know too. That confession changed the room. The performance hadn't only been for Dean. It hadn't only been for the audience. Part of Elvis had stepped beneath that spotlight because Dean's words had awakened an old fear. What if the lights mattered more than the voice? What if the clothes mattered more than the man? What if all the noise surrounding Elvis Presley had become bigger than Elvis himself? The producer asked softly. And? Elvis smiled. I think I got my answer. Then another knock came. Dean Martin stood in the doorway. But this time he wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry either. He looked troubled. Elvis frowned. What happened? Dean stepped inside and closed the door behind him. I need to tell you why I said it. Elvis's expression changed. Why? Dean looked toward the floor. For several seconds, he couldn't speak. Then he finally said, because I wasn't really angry at you. Elvis waited. Dean slowly raised his eyes. I was angry at what you reminded me of. The room became silent. Elvis leaned forward. What did I remind you of? Dean took a breath. And the answer he gave would turn their argument into something far more personal than either man had expected. Dean Martin closed the dressing room door. The laughter from the studio faded behind it. Elvis Presley sat beneath the mirror lights, staring at the man who had humiliated him only minutes earlier. Dean had just admitted something Elvis hadn't expected. I wasn't really angry at you. Elvis waited. Dean looked toward the floor. I was angry at what you reminded me of. The room became still. Elvis leaned forward. And what was that? Dean didn't answer immediately. He walked toward the mirror and stared at his own reflection. Then he gave a tired smile. You know what people see when I walk into a room. Elvis said nothing. They see Dean Martin. Dean gestured toward himself. The suit, the drink, the smile, the jokes, the songs. He paused. They think that's the man. Elvis watched him carefully. Dean's smile disappeared. But after enough years, he turned. Sometimes you start wondering where the performance ends. Elvis's expression changed. Dean continued. And then you came along. He pointed toward Elvis. Different clothes, different sound, different movement, a whole new generation screaming your name. His jaw tightened, and everybody started talking like music had changed overnight. Elvis finally understood. This wasn't really about whether he could sing. It was about time, about one generation watching another arrive, about a man who had spent years becoming important suddenly, wondering whether the world was preparing to move past him. Dean lowered his voice. I looked at you and saw everything getting younger. Elvis remained silent. Vasto. Another pause. Different. Dean looked toward the closed door. And maybe I hated how easily that made me feel old. Elvis stared at him. For the first time that evening, Dean Martin didn't look like an untouchable entertainment legend. He looked human. Elvis slowly stood. You think I don't know that feeling? Dean frowned. You. Elvis nodded. You think because they're screaming now, I don't wonder what happens when they stop. Dean stuttered him. Elvis walked toward the mirror. Every performer thinks about it. He looked at his reflection. Maybe not every day. A pause. But eventually, Dean's expression softened. Elvis continued. You walk onto a stage and thousands of people act like they'll love you forever. He turned toward Dean. But forever is a dangerous word in this business. Neither man spoke. Then Dean laughed quietly. Maybe we're more alike than I thought. Elvis smiled. That's usually what happens when you stop shouting long enough to listen. Dean looked at him, then laughed again. This time Elvis joined him. The hostility that had filled the corridor was disappearing. But Elvis wasn't interested in pretending nothing had happened. He stepped closer. You were still wrong. Dean raised an eyebrow. About my voice. About why you needed to attack it. Dean's smile vanished. Elvis continued. You thought making me smaller would make whatever you're afraid of disappear. Dean lowered his eyes. It doesn't work that way. I know. Do you? Dean looked back up. Elvis pointed toward the stage. If I'm successful tomorrow, it doesn't erase what you've already done. He paused. And if somebody new comes after me someday. His voice softened. They won't erase what I did either. Dean stared at him. Elvis smiled faintly. Music isn't a chair with room for only one man. Dean slowly nodded. That sentence seemed to release something inside him. For the first time, he understood that Elvis wasn't his replacement. He was simply another voice entering a room big enough for both of them. Dean extended his hand again. Elvis looked down at it, then took it. But this handshake was different. The first had been an apology. This one was respect. Dean said quietly, You're a better man than I was giving you credit for. Elvis shook his head. Don't make me too good. Dean smiled. Why? Then I'll have to spend the rest of my life disappointing everybody. Dean laughed. The door suddenly opened. A stage manager appeared. Dean, Elvis, we need both of you. Dean frowned. Both. The man nodded. Now. They exchanged a glance, then followed him. As they moved down the corridor, crew members watched them pass. Only minutes earlier, those same people had witnessed Dean pointing inches from Elvis's face and declaring, You can't sing. Now the two men walked side by side. No shouting, no threats, no triumph. The stage manager stopped near the curtain. The audience was still buzzing about Elvis's stripped-down performance. Dean could hear people talking about the note. The silence afterward. The standing ovation. He looked toward Elvis. "You know what bothered me most?" Elvis smiled. "That they liked it." Dean shook his head. "That you didn't look at me afterward." Elvis frowned. Dean continued. "You had the whole room." He pointed toward the audience. "You could have used every one of them against me." Elvis's expression became serious. "But you just bowed." Dean looked almost embarrassed. "That hurt worse." Elvis understood. Humiliation would have allowed Dean to become defensive. Grace left him nowhere to hide. Elvis answered quietly. "Winning a moment doesn't give you the right to take somebody else's dignity." Dean stared at him. The stage manager called. 30 seconds. Dean looked toward the curtain. Then back at Elvis. "What if I deserve it?" Elvis smiled faintly. "That's not my decision." Dean's eyes narrowed. "Then whose is it?" "Yours." Dean looked confused. Elvis continued. "You decide what kind of man you are after you're wrong." That silenced him, because Dean suddenly understood that Elvis wasn't giving him forgiveness as an escape. He was giving him responsibility. The curtain opened. The audience reacted immediately when they saw both men. Whispers, applause, a few nervous laughs. Everyone expected tension. Dean walked toward the microphone. Elvis remained several feet behind him. Dean looked into the audience, then toward Elvis. For a moment, he seemed uncertain. Finally, he spoke. "I said something backstage tonight." Elvis's expression changed. Dean continued. "Something about this young man." The room became quieter. Elvis took one step forward. Dean raised his hand. "No, kid." He looked directly at him. "I need to do this." Elvis stopped. Dean turned toward the audience. "I told Elvis Presley he couldn't sing." A wave of shocked murmuring moved through the room. Dean smiled bitterly. "Yeah." He nodded. "I know." Then he looked toward Elvis. "And then he walked onto this stage without an orchestra and made me look like the dumbest man in the building." The audience laughed. Even Elvis smiled. But Dean didn't. "I deserved that." Elvis immediately shook his head. Dean continued. "But here's the strange part." He looked around the theater. "He never tried to make me look stupid." The laughter disappeared. "He could have come backstage and crushed me." Dean pointed toward Elvis. "He didn't." He paused. "He told me making me feel small wouldn't make him any bigger." Elvis lowered his eyes. Dean's voice became quieter. "And I think I needed to hear that more than I needed to hear him sing." The audience became completely silent. Dean looked at Elvis, then said the words nobody backstage had expected him to say publicly. "I was wrong." Applause immediately began. Dean raised his hand. "Wait." The room quieted. Not just about his voice. Elvis looked up. Dean swallowed. "I thought I was testing whether Elvis was a real singer." He turned fully toward him. "Turns out I was testing what kind of man he was." A pause. "And I got my answer." The applause exploded. Elvis walked toward Dean. But instead of accepting the moment as a victory, he took the microphone. Dean stepped aside. Elvis looked toward the audience, then toward Dean. You want to know something about this man? Dean frowned. Elvis continued. Dean Martin is a great singer. Dean's eyes widened. The audience applauded. Elvis raised his hand. And that didn't stop being true because he was wrong about me. Dean stared at him. Elvis looked directly into his eyes. Your talent doesn't disappear just because you were wrong about mine. Dean's face changed. He looked away quickly, but not before Elvis saw the emotion in his eyes. The audience stood. One person, then another, until the theater was rising again. This time, not for a high note, not for Elvis alone, but for something far rarer. Two famous men had been given every opportunity to destroy each other. Instead, one had admitted he was wrong, and the other had refused to punish him for admitting it. Elvis handed the microphone back. Dean leaned toward him. His voice was barely audible beneath the applause. You know they're going to talk about this. Elvis smiled. They always do. No. Dean looked serious. I mean what happened backstage. Elvis's smile faded. Dean continued. They'll ask you why you didn't get angry. Elvis looked toward the standing audience, then toward the empty microphone beneath the spotlight. His answer came quietly. People will doubt you your whole life. Dean listened. You can spend your life fighting every person who says you can't. Elvis paused. Or you can spend that time becoming so good that the argument answers itself. Dean slowly nodded. But neither man knew that before the night ended, Elvis would be asked that exact question again. This time in front of reporters. And his final answer would reveal why being doubted had never been the real danger. The real danger was what success could turn you into after you proved them wrong. The reporters were waiting. Elvis Presley knew it before he even reached the end of the corridor. Camera flashes burst beyond the backstage doors. Voices overlapped. Questions flew through the air. And somewhere behind Elvis, the audience was still applauding. Only an hour earlier, Dean Martin had pointed a finger inches from Elvis's face and said the words nobody backstage expected. You can't sing. Elvis had answered beneath a single spotlight. No orchestra. No backup singers. No effects. Just one microphone. Then Dean had done something even more unexpected. He had walked onto the stage and admitted publicly that he had been wrong. But now came the dangerous part. Victory. Because Elvis understood something most people didn't. Being insulted could reveal your temper. But being proven right could reveal your character. The backstage doors opened. Elvis. Reporters immediately surrounded him. Did Dean really tell you that you couldn't sing? Elvis, was the performance meant to embarrass him? Were you angry? Did you demand an apology? Elvis stopped. Camera flashes exploded across his face. He slowly removed his sunglasses. One reporter pushed forward. Elvis, Dean challenged your entire career. Then you went on stage and proved him wrong in front of everybody. The reporter smiled. How does it feel to win? Elvis stared at him, then quietly asked, Win what? The reporter hesitated. The argument. Elvis looked back toward the stage. Dean was still somewhere beyond the curtain. Then Elvis shook his head. I wasn't trying to win an argument. The reporters became quieter. I was trying to remember something. What? Elvis looked toward the microphone visible through the curtain. Why I started. Silence. Another reporter called out. But you must have wanted to prove Dean wrong. Elvis smiled faintly. Maybe for a second. A few people laughed. Then his expression became serious. But if every person who doubts you becomes your enemy. He paused. You're going to spend your whole life fighting. The laughter disappeared. Elvis continued. People will doubt you your whole life. He glanced toward the stage. You can spend your life fighting every person who says you can't. Then looked directly toward the reporters. Or you can spend that time becoming so good that the argument answers itself. Nobody interrupted. A younger reporter raised his hand. Then why didn't you humiliate Dean afterward? Elvis's expression changed. Why would I? He humiliated you. He tried. And that doesn't bother you. Elvis thought for a moment. Sure, it bothered me. That answer surprised them. He wasn't pretending to be invulnerable. Elvis continued. But somebody hurting you doesn't mean you have to become cruel enough to hurt them back. A camera clicked. Then another. Elvis folded his sunglasses. When I came backstage, Dean expected me to tell him he was wrong. He smiled. I didn't need to. Why? Because everybody had already heard the answer. The reporters exchanged glances. Elvis continued. Making him feel small wouldn't make me any bigger. At that moment, someone appeared behind the reporters. Dean Martin. Elvis noticed him. Dean stopped. He had apparently heard everything. One reporter immediately turned. Dean. The cameras swung toward him. Do you still believe Elvis can't sing? Dean stared at the reporter. Then at Elvis. A mischievous smile appeared. Well, Elvis laughed. The tension broke for half a second. Then Dean became serious. No. The hallway quieted. I was wrong. Another reporter asked. About his singing. Dean looked toward Elvis. About more than that. He walked closer. I thought I was testing whether this kid was a real singer. Dean stopped beside him. Turns out. He gave Elvis a small smile. I was testing what kind of man he was. Elvis lowered his head. A reporter immediately asked, and what kind of man is he? Dean laughed softly. You watched the same thing I did. Then Elvis interrupted. Don't make me sound too good. Everyone laughed. Dean looked at him. Why? Elvis smiled. I've got tomorrow to get through. Dean stared at him for a moment, then burst out laughing. The reporters laughed too. But beneath the humor was something neither man had expected when the night began. Respect. Not because Dean had surrendered. Not because Elvis had conquered him. Because both men had been given a choice. Dean could defend his pride after discovering he was wrong. Instead, he admitted it. Elvis could punish Dean after proving him wrong. Instead, he protected his dignity. One reporter wasn't satisfied. Elvis, after everything Dean said, you still called him a great singer. Why? Elvis immediately answered. Because he is. But he questioned your talent. Elvis looked at Dean, then repeated the truth that had stunned him backstage. His talent doesn't disappear just because he was wrong about mine. Dean's smile vanished. Emotion appeared in his eyes again. He looked away. Elvis noticed but said nothing. That was enough. The reporters eventually began dispersing. Dean and Elvis walked back toward the dressing rooms together. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, Dean said, "You know what scares me?" Elvis looked over. "What?" "You made that look easy." "What?" "Not hitting back." Elvis smiled faintly. "It wasn't." Dean stopped walking. Elvis stopped too. Dean stared at him. "You wanted to." For a moment. Elvis laughed. "Absolutely." Dean smiled. "At least you're human." Elvis became serious again. "That's the point." Dean frowned. Elvis continued. "Strength isn't never feeling angry." A pause. "It's deciding what your anger gets to turn you into." Dean slowly nodded, then looked toward the stage. "So what would have happened if you'd gone out there and failed?" Elvis didn't answer immediately. That was the question nobody had asked. What if his voice had cracked? What if the audience hadn't stood? What if Dean's challenge had exposed exactly what he claimed? Elvis finally shrugged. "I would have walked backstage. And practiced." Dean laughed. "That's it." "What else?" Dean stared at him. Elvis continued. "If I failed tonight, that wouldn't mean Dean Martin was right forever." He pointed toward himself. "It would mean Elvis Presley had work to do tomorrow." Dean became quiet. There it was. The difference between ego and confidence. Ego needed to be right immediately. Confidence could survive being wrong. They continued walking. When they reached Elvis's dressing room, Dean stopped. "Kid." Elvis turned. Dean extended his hand. Again. But Elvis didn't take it. Instead, he opened his arms. Dean stared. "Oh, come on." Elvis smiled. Dean shook his head, then embraced him. Several crew members nearby stopped to watch. Hours earlier, these men had stood face to face in a corridor filled with anger. Now Dean slapped Elvis on the back. When they separated, Dean said, "Next time I tell you that you can't sing." Elvis raised an eyebrow. Dean smiled. "Ignore me." Elvis laughed, planning on doing it again. "You never know." Dean started walking away. Then Elvis called after him. "Dean." He turned. Elvis looked directly at him. "You really are a great singer." Dean's smile disappeared. Elvis continued. "And nothing that happened tonight changed that." Dean nodded once, then quietly walked away. Elvis entered the dressing room. For the first time all evening, he was completely alone. He removed his sunglasses, then the jeweled jacket. The room became quiet. No applause. No cameras. No Dean Martin. Just Elvis. He sat before the mirror. And perhaps this was the moment that mattered most. Because Dean's original challenge had never really been about a microphone. He had asked what remained when everything else was removed. Tonight, Elvis had found the answer. Take away the orchestra. Take away the backup singers. Take away the lights. Take away the clothes. Take away the screaming fans. What remains? A voice. A soul. An artist. But there was something else. Something more important. Character. The ability to be attacked without becoming hateful. The ability to prove someone wrong without needing to destroy them. The ability to receive applause without using it as a weapon. That was why the night mattered. Dean Martin saying Elvis Presley couldn't sing would eventually become the least important part. What mattered was what Elvis refused to do after the room stood for him. He didn't demand revenge. He didn't publicly destroy Dean. He didn't turn victory into humiliation. He let the work speak. And when the work finally silenced the argument, Elvis allowed the silence to become something better than revenge. Grace. Because sometimes the strongest response to someone doubting you isn't shouting louder. It isn't fighting harder. It isn't making them regret ever challenging you. Sometimes you simply walk beneath the spotlight. Remove every excuse. Do the work and let them watch. When someone doubts your talent, you don't have to shout louder than them. Let your work speak. And when it finally silences the room asterisk, don't use that silence to humiliate them. Use it to show them what grace looks like.